Oh, I just wanted to thank Aaron for his great work on clearing the sidewalks around the church when the snow falls. It's one of those sort of jobs that nobody ever notices. You just see the results of it, and when he's done a really good job, you tend not to notice it because there's no snow there. I suppose it's one of those jobs, Aaron, where if you did not do a good job, there would be snow everywhere and everybody would be complaining. But because you do such a good job, nobody complains and therefore nobody notices. But it's good to lift up those that have been faithful and done great work. And I just really appreciate Aaron, and Gary has been helping him this week around the church clearing the snow. So Aaron, we just want to thank you for that. Well, this week in the E100, we've been learning about the story of the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts. And if you have your Bible, turn to Acts chapter 9. And in Acts chapter 9 is the story of the Apostle Paul's conversion experience. I'm sure even if you have never read the Bible before, you've heard of the expression, a Damascus Road experience. Well, this is Paul's Damascus Road experience in Acts chapter 9. And this story is so full, so rich, so significant. I want to do something today and next week that we have not done through this E100 series, and that is that I want to split this message in half, and it'll spill over to next week as well. I want to show you 6 steps that are involved in becoming a Christian. And in fact, what I want to do through this passage is I want to show you yourself in the Damascus Road experience, because you are there. And I'm going to show you how you are there. If you're a Christian, you have experienced the 6 steps that the Apostle Paul experienced on the Damascus Road. Because there's a lot of misunderstanding about how to become a Christian in our culture. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what a Christian is. There's a lot of misunderstanding about who exactly is a Christian. I mean, some people think a Christian is anybody whose parents are Christians. I mean, I grew up in a Christian home. Got brought to church from before I was born. And that did not make me a Christian. Some people think religion makes you a Christian. I grew up in a country populated by Catholics and Protestants. I was a Protestant. My best friend was a Catholic. He had about 10 brothers and sisters because, of course, he was Catholic. And I used to help him to bring the bread home from the bakery every week. We took our little truck down to the bakery and we brought 15 loaves of bread home every week for his family. I used to help him pull his little wagon of empty bottles up to the top of our street to the big Catholic church to get them filled with holy water. And I remember how loud the bells in the Catholic Church would ring, and when we would go in through the front door, the strong smell of the incense. And I thought the Catholic Church was all about bells and smells. That was until we were both 10 or 11 years old. And then we were not allowed to talk to each other anymore. That was when I discovered hate, prejudice. We were both born in the same city, Belfast. Both grew up in the same neighborhood. We breathed the same air. We had the same color of skin. We spoke the same language. We had the same heavy Irish accent, but different religions. So Catholics and Protestants hated each other. Names often identified Catholics and Protestants. You can often tell a Catholic by their name. Same with a Protestant. Catholics and Protestants in my growing up days lived in different neighborhoods, worked at different factories. No Catholics worked in the shipyard. No Protestants lived on the Falls Road. We went to different schools. We shopped at different stores. And that's when I realized, 10, 11 years of age, that religion has nothing to do with being a Christian. Religion often has more to do with prejudice than purity, and more to do with race than grace. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about what a Christian is and how to become one. So I want to show you this morning and next week the 6 steps to becoming a Christian through the story of the Apostle Paul's conversion. It's fascinating. You'll love it. The Apostle Paul's life change was symbolized by his name change. So when you read through this story, you're going to read him as Saul, because that was his name before the Damascus Road experience. And then after the Damascus Road experience, his name gets changed to Paul. He was called Saul before his conversion. And then if you go to Acts 13 verse 9, you read, but Saul, who was also called Paul. So he got his name changed after he became a Christian. Symbolic of the life change that he went through. So I'll probably flip back and forth on the 2 names. I'm far more used to calling him Paul than Saul. So if I slip up and call him Paul instead of Saul, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Now, in one sense, Paul's conversion was unique. It's the only one of its kind, in one sense. Because Paul was unique. I mean, he was born a Jew, citizen of Rome, educated a Greek, by conversion a Christian. He wrote a major part of the New Testament. He was a missionary. He was a theologian who wrote theology. The book of Romans has been studied by theologians for the last 2,000 years, and they still haven't been able to plumb the depths of it. He was an evangelist. He was a pastor. He was a teacher. He was an organizer. He was a church practitioner. He was a leader. He was a thinker. He was a statesman. In my view, Paul was the greatest Christian who has ever lived. I mean, maybe there was another, but I'm not aware who it would be. I love Paul. I suppose it wouldn't be inaccurate for me to say Paul was my hero, is my hero. But though Paul was unique, though his Damascus Road experience was unique, in another sense, Paul's conversion was exactly the same as everybody else's. And in that sense, I want you to see yourself in Paul's Damascus Road experience. Because the Damascus Road experience contains the 6 steps to becoming a Christian. And if you're a Christian this morning, you will identify with all 6 of these steps. You'll be able to see yourself in all 6 of these steps. So let's see the 6 steps to becoming a Christian. And we'll probably just get through the first one this morning, and then we'll go through the next 5 next week. So 3 of the steps are things that happen to you. You have no control over. They happen to you. The other 3 are things that happen because of you, because of choices that you make. So let's get right into it. Step 1, and as I say, this is probably about as far as we'll get this morning. Step 1, connection. Contact. That's the first step in becoming a Christian. This step is something that happens to you. You have no control over it. You have nothing to do with it. This step is all about God. It's all about God's initiative. It's all about God's choice. This is where God reaches down from heaven and makes contact with you. He initiates it. This is God's sovereignty on display. We don't make contact with God. God makes contact with us. Jesus said, nobody can come to the Father unless the Father first makes contact with him. He doesn't say it quite that way. He says, unless the Father draws him. It's the same thing. God makes contact with you first. God makes a connection with you. And that's exactly what happens here on the Damascus Road. In Acts chapter 9, look at verse 3. Saul, see what I mean? Saul is traveling along this road to Damascus, and out of the blue, look at verse 3. Suddenly, a light from heaven shone around him. See, the heavenly initiative? Contact starts with heaven, comes down to Paul. See, the first connection is always initiated by heaven. That's the first step of becoming a Christian. Heaven initiates contact with you. That's exactly what happened to the Apostle Paul. That's exactly what Charles Wesley was talking about when he wrote those very familiar words to that hymn, "And Can It Be?" Here's what he says in the third verse. Long my imprisoned spirit lay, fast bound in sin, and reckless night, thine eye diffused a quickening ray. And then listen to this. I woke, The dungeon flamed with light. My chains fell off. My heart was free. It was God initiated. It started with God. The light came into the dungeon, the darkness of his soul. It's always that way. Christianity always works that way. People become a Christian always that way with that first step. Jesus explained it the best in John chapter 3 when he said to a fellow by the name of Nicodemus, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a person is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." Jesus is painting a picture of how to become a Christian. He's using an illustration. He's making a point using the most familiar analogy, picture that any human being in the world would clearly understand: physical birth. And all Jesus is saying is, when you were born the first time, you brought nothing to the table. You didn't do anything to make yourself born. Everything was done to you and for you. You never said, "Well, I think it's about time I got myself conceived." You never said, "I think it's about time that I got myself born." Guaranteed, no baby in history has ever said that. So it is with spiritual birth. People have this idea that I can work my way to heaven. People have this idea that I will reach out to God. That being a good person will get you into heaven. That's like saying, "Well, I think it's about time that I got myself spiritually conceived." That's like saying, "It's about time I got myself born again." You can't. Everything is done for you and to you. God makes the contact. God takes the initiative. God decides when spiritual life will be conceived in your mind. God decides when you will be born again in your heart. That's what Romans chapter 3 is all about. Romans chapter 3 says, nobody understands God. Nobody seeks after God. Everybody has turned aside. Nobody does good. Not even one. That's the whole point of Romans 3. Contact is something that is done to you. Now, let's see what kinds of people God makes contact with. Because I suppose some people have the idea, well, if God's the one making the contact, well, I guess then he only makes contact with good people. He only makes contact with the lovely people. He only makes contact with the desirable people. Well, look at verse 1. But Saul, as we've said, that's before he gets the name change. And look what it says, still breathing out threats and murder. The word breathe literally means to breathe in. It doesn't mean to breathe out. If your version says he was breathing out, that's actually not literal. The literal translation is he was breathing in. In other words, Paul was living and breathing an atmosphere of hate and violence and death. Against who? Against the disciples of the Lord, Christians. The Apostle Paul, amazingly, while he was Saul, was a hatchet man for the Pharisees. He was on a mission in Acts 9, verse 1, to exterminate the Christians. And he was fanatical about it. Look at verse 2. He went to the high priest and he asked for letters to the synagogues at Damascus. Interestingly, the Christians in the early days of the church were always found in the Jewish synagogue, because that's where the Christians first emerged. Out of the Jewish synagogue, Jewish people became Christians. And so in those early days, if you wanted to find a group of Christians, you went to the synagogue. And so he went to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, that's what followers of Christ were called, the way. That's because Jesus said, I am the way. It's a beautiful word to be called the people of the way. Jesus said, narrow is the way that leads to life. It's a good name. It's the only way. Proverbs says there is a way that seems right unto a man, but the way therein is the way of death. And then notice who he's going after. Man or, what's it say? Women. That he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Why? To do what? Well, to do what he did to Stephen 2 chapters earlier in chapter 7. Stephen is the first Christian martyr recorded in the book of Acts, stoned to death. And Saul was in charge of Stephen's death. Look at chapter 7, verse 58. It says, the crowd laid their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. That signifies that Saul was in charge of Stephen's death. And look at chapter 8, verse 1. Saul approved of his execution. Now look at chapter 9, verse 1. Saul is a fanatical Pharisee who hates Christians. And he travels all the way up to Syria, because that's where Damascus is, in order to drive Christian men and women, and who knows, maybe children as well, back to Jerusalem, 160 miles away, in order to have them stand trial and to be stoned to death. Look at chapter 8, verse 3. Saul was ravaging the church. That's a strong word. He was causing havoc in the church. And look what it says. He was entering house after house, driving off men and women and probably children, and throwing them in prison. Maybe in recent memory, our generation is perhaps the first generation that can fully understand the repulsiveness of what Saul was doing here. He was doing here what the members of ISIS are doing today with men, women, and children who name the name of Christ in Syria and northern Iraq today. This connection that God initiates is not just to people that we think of as good people, the nice people, the likable people. In fact, there are no good people as far as God is concerned. Romans 3 says there are no good people. In fact, Romans 3 verse 22 says there is no difference. And then verse 23 says, all have sinned. See, the problem is not how bad we are. The problem is how good we're not. How bad a person is not the issue. No matter what failures or mistakes or wrong choices you have ever made in your life, God is able to reach out to you and make a connection with you. And if he did it with a hate and murder-breathing Saul, nobody is untouchable. Nobody is undesirable in heaven's eyes. In fact, God has been sowing seeds during this period of Saul's life that is going to lay the groundwork for the conversion that's going to happen in this chapter, chapter 9. Stephen's death had left a footprint on Paul's psyche. In Acts chapter 6, if you go back a couple of chapters, in Acts chapter 6, verse 10, it says that Stephen was debating the religious leaders. That probably included Paul. And nobody could withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which Stephen was speaking. None. Nobody was able to get the better of Stephen in his debate about Christ. Stephen won every debate hands down. Nobody could withstand Stephen, and that would have included Saul. So Saul didn't leave those discussions unmarked. That's where I believe Saul's conversion began. God was planting seeds in Saul's mind at that time that was beginning to dislodge the props of Saul's life and was beginning to erode all of the foundation that Saul had built up in his life. That undoubtedly that left a mark on Saul. Then, when Stephen was being stoned to death, right before he died, Stephen says, "Father, let not this sin be held against them." Saul heard that. Remarkable. Saul has never seen a man die like Stephen ever before. There's no question this left an imprint on Saul's life. And at first, it intensified the fanaticism to stamp out Christianity. But it was also deconstructing Saul's own flawed belief system. And God often does that. God often sows seeds years earlier to bring a person to faith. Abraham Lincoln, in one of the autobiographies of his life, never forgot the first time he ever saw a slave auction. It was in 1831. And that marked Abraham Lincoln forever. It would be 32 years later that he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. All from the first seed of seeing that first slave auction. That's what's happening to Saul in chapter 6, 7, and 8. And so now, as he's on his way, he's fueled by this fanaticism to hate and crush this Christianity movement. So he approaches Damascus, and suddenly this light from heaven shines around him. God has made contact. God has made the connection. Saul was not looking for God. Saul was on his way to Damascus, but God suddenly broke in. And that's what happened to every single one of you who are Christians here this morning. There was a day when God broke in to your life and established contact. You were on the Damascus Road. You weren't hopefully you weren't breathing out murderous threats. You probably didn't experience this brilliant, blazing light shining from heaven, but God broke in nevertheless, suddenly. And God probably used some prior experiences in your life to bring you to that place of surrender to Him. My night was November 1980. Back row, People's Church. I could take you there today and show you where it was, right over on the left-hand side. I'd been going to church every week for months. And that night, suddenly, God made contact. There was no brilliant, blazing light. I didn't hear any audible voice. But God broke in on my life suddenly, unexpectedly, out of the blue. I've been going to church for months. And God used previous experiences to bring me to that defining moment. I used to go to Sunday school every Sunday as a wee boy. From year one. I remember memorizing all the verses. I memorized Isaiah 53. I got pictures every year for memorizing my verses. I got Bibles for prizes every year. I got extra credit when I brought a friend to Sunday school. I made some sort of a spiritual commitment to God when I was 9 years old in front of the fireplace with my grandfather. I can remember that night like it was yesterday. I was at 9 years of age, but by the time I got to my teenage years, I was on the run from God. Didn't want to go to church. I remember occasionally my mom and dad would make me get into the back of the car as a young teenager and make me come to church with them. And I remember hiding in the back seat when I saw my friends because I didn't want them to see me in the back of the car and go to church. I was on the run all through my teens. Came to Canada in 1979 at 18 years of age to start a new life, new job, make lots of money, buy lots of toys. I already got started on that, buying a sailboat and a big T-bird car. And then that night, November 1980, 2 years after being in Canada, Christ met me at the back of People's Church. Never looked back. I've never regretted that night in 35 years. I wouldn't give up that night for all the money in the world. Christ has never let me down. He's never been faithless to me. I've let him down many, many times over the years. But Christ met me that night at the back of People's Church without an audible voice, without a bright, brilliant light. But it was as real for me as the initial contact that Saul had with Christ on the Damascus Road, and it was as real as many as you had that day when you met Christ. Now, many of you can't put the date on it when it happened. Some of you it happened at a very, very young age, and some of you can't remember exactly when it was. You don't have to remember exactly when it was, but you can look back to a period in your life and you can say, that's where Christ met me, and it changed my life from that day to this. See, your testimony does not need to be dramatic. The greatest miracle and the greatest expression, in my estimation, of God's power is when a good person who has lived a good life and has been a decent citizen of the country realizes their need to surrender to Christ in order to get to heaven. And that they are as lost as a mass murderer. That, in my estimation, is one of the most powerful miracles when God shows a decent, upstanding citizen of the country that they are as lost as Saul. When I hear someone give a testimony like that, yeah, I didn't really do a lot of wrong things. Sort of went to school, got good grades, got a good job, didn't really stray off the path. But there was a day in my life when Christ met me and I realized I was a sinner and I was headed for hell. And that Christ was calling me to bow the knee to him and to live for him and to please him for the rest of my life. Man, I'd love to hear a testimony like that. Greatest testimonies of all. It's the first step. Connection. Contact. Happened to many of you. Happened to most of you. If you're here this morning and you don't identify with that, you don't recall that God has ever made that contact with you. Here's the greatest news you've ever heard. God brought you here this morning to establish that contact. He's establishing contact with you right now. He wants you to know that you are on the Damascus Road. And he loves you. And he thinks enough of you to get you out of bed this morning, to bring you here today, because he wants to establish contact with you. If you come back next week, you'll see the next 5 steps. Some of them are like this step, nothing to do with you. Out of your hands, out of your control. I could not have scripted what happened to me that night at People's Church. It happened to me. It didn't happen because of me. There's a couple more steps just like that you'll see next week that happened to you. But then there's 3 other steps that happened because of you. And you'll see those next week. So don't miss next Sunday morning, I promise you. You'll find it really interesting, really fascinating, and really helpful. Peter?